Okay, right. So if I'm looking over here, then it's because
That's okay.
my monitor's here, my laptop's here, so I'm not
Fine.
purposely looking away.
I do the same.
So I will just get started and just jump right in. So if you could please state your name and what your occupation is and what your role within your occupation is, please.
Yeah, so I'm Dr. Kerry Dinsmore. I work for FIDRA, an environmental charity, and I'm a senior projects manager there. So my role is looking after our work in chemical pollution, so working with policymakers, industry, and a bit of public engagement on chemicals of concern.
Okay. So what exactly is FIDRA? What is the charity? What kind of work do they undertake? And yeah, what exactly is the charity about?
So FIDRA is an environmental charity. We're based in Scotland, but we tend to work at sort of UK-wide remit. Sometimes we have to work with the EU, depending on what the subject is and where the policies lie. But usually we're focused on UK. We choose projects where we think there is a environmental solution that just needs to be promoted, whether that's promoting it through industry or policy. But there's something where there is a clear problem, evidence-based behind it, and we have a solution. So we're very solution focused and we choose our projects based on that, which means that we work on lots of different things. So we have some people working on plastics. We've done work with cotton buds before, where we've looked specifically at how do we make a cotton bud less environmentally damaging. So we worked with major industries, got them to switch from plastic stem to paper stem, and then we were able to take that to policy level and get rid of that source of plastic pollution. And we tend to replicate that approach across different projects. So sometimes we're working with industry, we're showing that there's alternatives to a particular pollutant that's available, it's on the market, encouraging to switch, and then we encourage this to be taken onto policy so we get that wide environmental benefit. But we're always looking at focused environmental benefits, and that really could span anything.
Okay. So obviously the sort of main goal of today is to sort of answer some questions about PFAS chemicals. And that's sort of the what our campaign is basically about. So could you possibly give me some just general information on what PFAS chemicals are from a completely outsider's perspective, what exactly they are, how, and how it came to be that I heard a statistic somewhere that now 99% of the world's population has been exposed to these chemicals, and how exactly that came about.
Yeah, so PFAS, firstly, it stands for per and polyfluorinated alkyl substances. You don't need to remember that. Call them PFAS. They're often referred to as forever chemicals. And this is because they last for basically forever in the environment. We know that some of them have half-lives in the environment of 1,000 years. So once they get in the environment, it takes thousands of years for them to actually disappear and degrade. So what they are is they're a very specific group of chemicals. It's a really large group of chemicals. There's, depending on who's estimating it and what they're basing their definition on, over 4,000 of these chemicals. So it's a really massive group. What they all have in common is that they have a really strong carbon-fluorine bond. So they are built like a chain of carbon atoms, basically like a pearl necklace. Some of those have attachments to fluorine. And that attachment between the carbon and fluorine is one of the strongest bonds that we know in nature. And that's what makes them so persistent, and what makes this persistent something that's common across the whole group. So they are chemicals, lots of different versions of them, and they've then been used for lots of different things. That bond that makes them very damaging to the environment, because they're persistent and they're persistent in our bodies, also makes them useful. So that means that they are very strong, they're very stable. It's very hard to get things to stick to them. So because they don't react chemically, you can put a frying egg on top of it and it won't stick. So the big problem there was getting it to stick to the pan in the first place. But once they solve that problem, then you have a really good non-stick surface. What they also do is that they repel grease and they repel water. And they do that very well. There are other things that repel water equally well, but that grease repellency is something that is very, very strong in PFAS. So you find that they're used for waterproofing, for durable water repellency, for stain resistance and grease repellent. And again, if you just look at everything that we have in our lives, you can see why they suddenly became really useful. So, you know, the non-stick pan, everybody wants one because they know they can fry their egg and they don't need as much oil. So that took off in the consumer sphere. Also stain resistant. You know, we look at, you've got stain resistance on your clothing, you've got it on your sofa, you've got it on your carpet, you've got it on your curtains, you've got it everywhere. So, you know, here's a function that we didn't look at the downside, we just saw the positive, and again, that's just gone everywhere.
Yeah.
Things that what we want to be non-stick. It's not just your pan. You also say things like ski waxes, snowboard waxes, you know, anything you don't want to stick to get that really smooth surface. So again, use has just exploded. They also help liquids to mix together and to stay in mixture. So when you're adding lots of different things together and you're selling it on, you want it to stay in that mixture, and that makes them really useful in things like cleaning products. So again, there's a whole other sphere where they've just taken off. So what we find is that because of these quite technical uses, their uses have just expanded. We use them in so many products. We're surrounded by them every single day, whether you're in your home, your office, your car, they are everywhere. But it's only more recently, and well, not that recently, we've known for quite a long time now, but we're starting to understand the downsides of these. Firstly, because they don't degrade, they get everywhere. So no matter what the use is, whether you're putting it straight down your sink and it's going straight out into the ocean, or whether it's something with a longer chain where you're washing your clothes and then it goes through. But ultimately, these things are always going to find their way to the environment. You throw your sofa into the landfill site. Eventually, those chemicals are going to come out of that sofa and they're going to end up in the environment. So they are building up in the environment. They're building up around us. We consume them sometimes directly because they're getting on from, for example, the food packaging onto the food, and then we eat it. Sometimes because they're in the environment, they're being taken up by crops. We know they bioaccumulate up food chains. So they're taken up by crops. The animals then feed on them. We then feed on the animals, but they're building up. So the further you are in the food chain, and of course, we're top predators, the more of these you get. So they really are just building up around us, and we're exposed. And that's why we're now in the situation where no matter where you live in the world, you don't need to be close to where they're being used or close to where they're manufactured, because they are so consistent across the globe. That's why we're finding studies coming out now where 99% of people have these in their bodies. What we know less about is the toxicology effects. So there are so many of these that research, we really only know a lot of detail about 2 of them, 3 of them, 4 of them, you know, lesser about under 10. We really know very little about this huge group. But the ones that we do know a lot of research about, then we know that they have these really adverse effects on both humans and wildlife. So that's where we see things like increased rates of cancers and immune problems, fertility issues, even obesity has been linked to these. And the reduced effectiveness of vaccinations is another one, looking specifically at tetanus. So there's a huge range of impacts they can have. And we're really only scratching the surface in what we know. But what we do know is that across the whole group, this persistence is going to be there. So whatever we don't know today, those chemicals are still going to be in the environment for generations to come. And that's why we're saying that whether or not we have all the evidence of harm for every one of these chemicals, we have to act on it, because the risk of not taking action now is that they continue to build up and then we can't get them back out of the environment.
So you mentioned these 2 terms, biopersistence and bioaccumulation. Could you possibly define what those terms mean? Yeah,
persistence is how long it takes for it to completely disappear, to go away completely. And there's different levels. So you have biotransformation, and this is one of the things that does happen with PFAS. So you can have some of these are really big, long molecules, really big ones called polymers. Those are the sort of ones that are used, for example, on the stain-resistant treatments. That will be the polymer PFAS. Now that's so big, that polymer, that it's very hard for it to be taken up by the cells in our body. Sorry, someone's just come in. Yeah, just a second, Pop. Good go. Okay, I'll start to answer again in a second. Kids just come in. Sorry.
That's all right.
So I can't remember where I was before all that.
You're saying about so the biopersistence is how it exists in the environment.
Okay, yeah. So they can biotransform. So you've got these very long polymers Now, those are so big that it's very hard for the cells in your body to take them up. So they themselves are very unlikely to cause any harm to you. But what they can do is, in producing these, you have to use the smaller ones. And those are the smaller ones that are dangerous to us. And equally, when they get in the environment, they won't degrade completely, but they will biotransform into smaller ones. So you essentially have one very long chain of molecules, and that can break up, and then it breaks into smaller things. So that's biotransforming. But they transform into smaller ones, and then they hit this endpoint, and then they won't go away. And it's those endpoints that persist in the environment. And that's where we look at things like half-lives, which is how long it would take for half of that substance to go away. So that's not getting rid of it, but half of it will disappear within 1,000 years. And in terms of bioaccumulation, that's when the further up a food chain you go, the more of these chemicals build up. So if you think a very, very small piece of phytoplankton takes up a handful of these molecules, and then a fish comes along and has, hundreds of these phytoplankton, suddenly they get an awful lot more PFAS. And again, a bigger fish eats lots of those smaller fish. So every time you go up a level in the food chain, it's multiplying. And what that means is that the biggest concentrations are in the top predators. And these are the, really iconic animals that we look at, the polar bears, the orcas, and us, we are top predators. So the more you go up the chain, the more concentrated the contamination becomes.
Wow. And so you mentioned earlier on about new evidence sort of coming to light about these chemicals inhibiting the effectiveness of vaccines and stuff. Do you think there's the possibility that having these chemicals in our bloodstream could have a negative impact on the effectiveness of the COVID-19 vaccines?
I think we don't know that information at the moment. So the only study that's been done is looking at the effectiveness of tetanus. And that showed quite clearly that that was less effective where people had concentrations of PFAS in their blood. There are other studies that have shown, for example, people with high concentrations of certain types of PFAS have had more severe COVID symptoms. So, it's a really interesting area at the minute, and it's something everybody's asking. We know that they attack people's immune system, and it's immunity that's the problem. So there's certainly a lot of connection there. But this is such a huge group of chemicals that research will take a long time to come out. So I don't think we have clear answers at the minute, but certainly we know that they damage immunity. So we don't want them, and this is a bad time to be having them.
Yeah. And so you said about how there's been several serious health effects linked to these chemicals, including cancer. And if you're talking about sort of the level of toxicity of dangerous PFAS chemicals, is there any way of being able to compare them to other toxic substances such as lead, arsenic, asbestos, things like that?
It's a very, very difficult thing to do because when we're exposed to PFAS, we're also exposed to a whole range of flame retardants, plasticizers, everything else that's in our environment every day. So what we can't do is those human studies where you're actually looking at the impact of it. So I would say it's always going to be very difficult to pick apart what it is that's genuinely causing it. And that's why we sort of find relationships, but it's very, very difficult to prove direct causal harm from an environmental pollutant to somebody's health. So we look at lab studies, and obviously there's some animal studies, and you can show that. And then the question is always, where do you accept the risk? And that's a policy decision to be made, but it's very hard to compare. What makes PFAS different to a lot of other substances is this persistence, and that in itself should be reason enough, because any lack of information, the consequences of getting a policy decision wrong are much greater when you have a persistent chemical.
And so with the sort of the health effects and stuff, and I think I've heard statistics posted by Cancer Research UK as an example that 1 in 2 of us will get cancer in our lifetime. Do you think that, considering the extent and sort of the breadth of exposure across the world's population, do you think that there's the potential that statistic is so high because of our exposure to these chemicals?
I think that exposure is probably very high because of these chemicals and other ones. So one of the things that PFAS are endocrine disruptors, and we know that means that they are impacting the hormone systems, and it's hormonal cancers as well that are on the increase and that have increased drastically. So I think endocrine disrupting chemicals that are in our environment and they're exposed to every day, I think as a group, yes, those have a very important impact in it. Trying to pick apart what percentage of that is coming down to PFAS, or as I mentioned before, flame retardants are another group that we're all exposed to. There's a lot of endocrine disruptors. So I think they're one part in a puzzle, and it's a very difficult puzzle to pick apart. But that, yeah, it's a difficulty in getting the research, and that will always exist. It's not something that we can sit and wait for, if you understand. I mean, we won't ever have that full information on this full group of chemicals. And that's why we talk about using things like the precautionary principle when we're putting together policy.
And so could you define exactly what the precautionary principle is?
Yeah, so the precautionary principle is, it's one of the fundamental principles that's used for environmental policy making across the EU and has been brought into the UK. And it's where you're accepting that a lack of information or a lack of complete knowledge on a subject shouldn't prevent policy action. And again, it's understanding that scientific uncertainty is inevitable, but it's at what point do we take action? And you cannot wait for scientific certainty before taking action. And again, where there's persistence, that precautionary approach is so much more important, because it's all about balancing the risk of doing nothing.
Yeah. And so given the incredibly long half-life of these chemicals, do you think that there's the potential that these chemicals could potentially outlive humanity in the environment, you know, lasting for millennia? Do you think that that's a possibility, that even after we're gone, these chemicals would still remain in the environment?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I think, you know, we look at different eras in history and we can say, you know, this is the Iron Age, this is the something else age, and we've got the plastic age, and, you know, we have these chemicals that are going into the environment that will stay there forever, and that is the mark that we're leaving on the environment. For, you know, we really don't know how long they're going to be there, but as I say, some of them we know that the half-life is 1,000 years. So yeah, absolutely.
Wow.
This is a permanent mark we're leaving on our planet. And the other thing to note is that there are some uses of PFAS that are very difficult to get rid of. You know, they do have very unique properties. They are used in some medical equipment and things like this, where it is very difficult to just get rid of them. We do need to innovate and develop alternatives. But equally, there is a vast amount of uses that we are using PFAS for right now that are not necessary. So, you know, at FIDRA, we've been working on food packaging, because we know that there are plenty of plastic-free paper and board food packaging that supermarkets, takeaways can be using that don't contain PFAS. But what they are using is that because there isn't that awareness, we are actually replacing that plastic packaging, which it's a visible, persistent pollutant, for one that is less visible, but potentially more harmful. And that's why we need to have that policy, so that when we're making these environmental switches, we're doing it to something that's genuinely better. You know, we find very high levels of PFAS in the molded fiber compostable packaging that's currently being used, you know, as a sustainable alternative to plastic. And yet that contains really high levels of PFAS, and that shouldn't be acceptable. And it's not needed because there are alternatives. Similarly, we're adding PFAS to, it's actually used in some swimming costumes and some swimming things to make them dry quicker, to make them repel water. And I mean, that's completely unnecessary use. And the only reason they're there is because people don't have that awareness of them. But there are so many unnecessary uses that we can just take off the market today. Cosmetics, some brands use PFAS, some don't. And, you know, that is a very clear indication that they can be made perfectly well without PFAS. And the consumer will never know, because that, you know, consumer doesn't know whether that contains PFAS or not. And they're perfectly happy either way. So why are we using it in the first place? So starting to pick away these really unnecessary, simple uses, that's where we can get rid of a lot of the PFAS. And then we can drive innovation towards the uses where there is a benefit to society and where we do need something to replace them. And
so the two biggest manufacturers of these chemicals, I think when sort of in the 90s and 2000s, was 3M and DuPont. Do you know when exactly manufacturers of these chemicals first started to recognize that there were negative health effects with these chemicals?
No, I mean, I don't know the specifics of each of the cases, but I mean, certainly, I think you're well aware this is the sort of story that came out as part of Dark Waters, and there's a lot of controversy knowing that they've, I think that knowledge has been there for a very long time.
Mm-hmm.
It's getting it into the public sphere is where the difficulty lies.
Yeah. So I heard somewhere that PFAS chemicals are used as surfactants. Could you possibly shed some light onto what exactly a surfactant is?
Yeah, so that makes, I'm trying to think of a simple way of putting it, but again, that goes back to how they make liquids react. So they keep things in mixtures, and they also, it's how they wet a surface. And what they means is that you can actually get away with less, for example, soap in something to get the same effect. And what it does in real life situations is it makes that sort of streak-free finish. So it makes things go on smoothly. It also, it's all about smoothing the liquid. So they're useful in things like paints, waxes, varnishes, and I think you want that smooth finish. That would be a surfactant property. And it's all to do with how the liquid reacts to the material that it's set on.
I heard a quote from one of the, it was sort of a hearing about this chemical, and a lot of the consumers, so industrial consumers of these chemicals all came together, and everyone, and there were lots of quotes flying around about how these chemicals are, quote, mission critical for the manufacturing of everything from consumer products to aircraft hydraulics, firefighting foam. Do you think that these chemicals are in fact mission critical, and if so, why is that?
This is one of the big topics that's under discussion at the minute. So across the EU, they've agreed to put through a universal PFAS regulation, and what they're basing their regulation on is that they want to phase out the terminology changes, but essentially all non-essential uses of PFAS. So I think there is an acknowledgement that there are essential uses. Now, what that means and how that's defined will depend very much on a stakeholder and who it is that's talking. So they are sort of defining it as something that is critical to society. Now, the question then comes in, are we talking about consumer choice? What is critical to society? So again, I draw attention to things like medical devices where there really is a life-saving use. You can be quite clear that we can't get rid of that function. Hopefully, we can get rid of the chemical. Sometimes there's an alternative. If there's an alternative, that's not mission critical. You can switch to something else. So I think the question that has to be asked is, firstly, do you need the function? And then secondly, is there another way of achieving the function? If the answer to those is that you do need it and there isn't, well, then that is essentially classified as essential use. And that you could call mission critical. What we need to be doing is identify where that genuinely happens, and that's where we drive innovation towards. But of course, then you get into a lot of debate about this sort of societal choices. So if you look at a durable water repellency on a waterproof jacket, if you are standing at the top of Mount Everest in a jacket in a snowstorm, then making sure that that is genuinely water repellent, that is critical to your health and safety. Now, the question is, are there other substances that can give you that function to the same degree? And there probably is these days. Maybe there wasn't 10 years ago. But then the other question is, well, do you need to be standing at the top of Mount Everest? And that, of course, that's a much bigger societal question. And then you have the question, well, if this guy at Mount Everest can wear this jacket, does that mean that I can't wear it going down the street? And where do you draw that line? Can you only give it to people at the top? So there's a lot of social questions that come into it. And that's what we really have to be careful, that we're not being drawn into those arguments, and that we really are making sure that if something is essential or mission critical, it really is, and it will make a genuine difference to society. And then you should be down to a very narrow amount of uses. And then we drive innovation towards those, because, it really is amazing what people can innovate. We we worked with the Danish Co-op. It's one of the biggest supermarkets in Denmark. So in 2015, they decided to get rid of PFAS in their food packaging. They became aware of the issue and they decided to take straight, immediate action. They announced it on TV before they'd really gone through the process of figuring out how to do this. So it was a really big leap that they took. And they managed to work with all their suppliers to get rid of PFAS in all of their different parts of food packaging. The one thing they couldn't do was microwave popcorn. Now, everybody came back to them and said, we cannot make microwave popcorn that doesn't have PFAS. And it's to do with it having to be grease repellent and the heating and everything combined, but they couldn't get that function. So they said, look, this is impossible. This is the one thing we can't change. So the Danish Co-op said, well, okay, we're not going to sell microwave popcorn anymore. And they actually withdrew the product from all of their supermarkets across Denmark. And I think it was less than a year. I think it was 9 months later, the supplier came back to them and said, we've solved it. And you know what it took was somebody to say, well, that's fine. We're not going to sell it until you fix it. And then they fixed it. And it just goes to show, if you really put the pressure on, you know, we can fix these problems. We can overcome them.
Great. And so for our campaign, there needs to be sort of like a bit of a focus on sort of the digital side of things. And through my research, I found that there are a few sort of journal articles and a few sort of like documents online about semiconductors and the semiconductor industry. Do you know anything about the semiconductor industry and their relationship with PFAS chemicals at all?
No, I'm aware that they're one of the uses, but it's not something we've looked into the detail of. I'm afraid I can't help with that one.
Okay, no worries. So say, because all of these chemicals are in so many different consumer products, and obviously whether it be electronic devices or sofas or clothing, people throw things away, people recycle things, and they end up at landfills or recycling centres and stuff. And in particular with electronic devices, a big thing is they go to these e-waste dumps in countries in Africa and stuff. And so do you think that perhaps communities which surround landfills and e-waste dumps are more at risk of high PFAS exposure than, say, the average person?
Yeah, definitely. And I think there's a lot of other chemical issues with that as well. You know, flame retardants in electronics is a really big issue, and we use some really nasty ones in electronics. So again, I think that is a really important issue to be looking at what's in that we are sending and how it's being contained. Because again, if we're containing it in the UK, we have a level of control over that. Once it goes abroad, you know, they're not being contained in lined landfills. They're not being dealt with properly. And that is a really important source of the environment. Yeah. The other thing to note when it comes to things like landfill too is the impact that climate has on this. You know, we know that extreme flooding is becoming much more of an issue across the UK and the rest of the world, of course, as well. But that means that the landfills that had been built in the past and that are full to the brim with consumer products with PFAS in them, suddenly they're much more likely to flood. You know, there's a much more likelihood of that coming out of the landfill now. So that's a really big growing problem that we have in the UK is, we have dumping at the side of the road, you know, all those mattresses covered in things. You know, it's not just the mattress itself that's the problem, it's what's coming out of it. And PFAS is one of those things. So there's illegal dump sites, but even the legal ones are beginning to release much more than they planned because our climate is changing.
And so because I think these health effects or the confirmed health effects in humans came about after the largest epidemiological study in the history of science with the citizens of Parkersburg in West Virginia. Surely then after, you know, I think I heard somewhere that there isn't a chemical on the market that we know so much about now after this study. Surely these chemicals have been phased out by governments across the globe, surely.
Well, so that study looked specifically at PFOS, which is one form of PFAS, and that's really the crux of the problem. So we have PFOS and away are both restricted under the Stockholm Convention. So we have two that we've known about for a long time. They were sort of the original ones in use. So they are restricted, and they are globally restricted. But the problem is that we have this vast group of PFAS that all have very, very similar properties. So it's a different chemical and therefore falls under different rules. But molecularly, their structure is very similar. We know that the persistence is similar. Of course, the toxicology is not going to be the same across the entire group, but there's a lot of similarities in them. And it's all about how do we do that read across. So we are, in some sense, protecting people now against PFAS, but yet we still know that people have it in their system. We still know that in the UK, in drinking water, we have high levels of this. The recent Cambridgeshire study, that found very high levels of PFAS coming out in drinking water that people are being exposed to. So it's still a problem, and that's because of the persistence. But again, we aren't looking at the wide range of PFAS that have come in to replace those. So as soon as we restrict one, we bring in another one. So another substance, Gen X, that came in to replace some of the restricted ones. And now, 10, 20 years later, we know that that is nearly just as bad. It is just as bad. It's just as persistent, and it's mobile. So we have this regrettable substitution, and that's why all the focus at the minute and what we're really pushing for is that we restrict them not one by one, because that will take us tens of thousands of years, but we restrict them as a group. And we say, look, we know enough about this group to say that they all need to be restricted, and we just simply cannot keep moving from one to molecular similar one. The next one down the chain.
I was actually going to, the next question I was going to ask you was about the UK in particular, and sort of what the state of exposure was in the UK, because I think a lot of the information online is very US based, because obviously that's where sort of the whole thing kind of stemmed from in the first place. But from your knowledge in the UK in particular, what is the state of exposure? How do UK citizens compare to our US counterparts in terms of the levels that we have in our blood, and again in the drinking water?
Unfortunately, that's I'm going to give you a really vague answer, because the truth is we really don't know in the UK. And the reason that there's so much focus, I think, on the US is not just because they have the movie and not just because they have the company. It's because they actually know what's in their drinking water. They know what's in people. Same with across Europe. They have a much better understanding of what's in their drinking water. And there's been a lot of cases across, for example, the Netherlands, where there's local communities rising up and they're taking action on this. And that's because they know what's there. In the UK, we don't monitor it. We don't know what's in our population. We don't really do biomonitoring studies, or certainly not sufficient ones. We monitor just a handful of PFAS in our water. And even that, we haven't been doing it in our drinking water sufficiently. So that's one of the really big issues in the UK, is that we are flying blind. We don't know what's in our water. But again, this is why the recent studies that come out of Cambridgeshire, so that was done by journalists. It wasn't done by UK government, but those were journalists that went out and they collected water samples from people's taps, and they found very high concentrations that were above the drinking water limits in water that people are drinking right now. And that's a very small sample size. So we know that it is a problem. We have no idea how big the problem is. But I think there's definitely a lot more information to come out on where we stand in the UK. We know that this is a problem in every other country, so there's no reason to believe that we're safer here.
And so how has it come to be, do you think, in your opinion, that there's still such a broad inequality of information regarding the extent of PFAS exposure to global citizens? I mean, you would have thought, because the media loves these kind of whistleblowing stories and these, and sort of scandals and things. The media loves that kind of thing. But everyone who I've spoken to within my peer group, and that's across all ranges, from my grandparents to my friends at uni, absolutely nobody knows what it is. I mean, the people like my parents and that kind of generation have heard of Teflon, because that was a very 70s, 80s kind of thing. But in terms of my age group, no one knows what Teflon is. No one's heard of DuPont. No one knows what any of these things are. How do you think it's come to be that there's still, even though we've got all of this evidence and there is a lot of information out there on just how bad these chemicals are, that people still don't know about them?
I think it's a really interesting question, because if you look at, I mean, there are stories every single day in US newspapers about PFAS in local communities. Similar, you get quite a lot coming out of Australia as well, and there's been a lot of stuff in Europe, and yet we're not talking about it in the UK. And I think, to me, one of the big things is having that direct community impact, because we don't know what's in our drinking water and because we aren't testing it. And, you know, the pessimist in me would suggest, well, are we not testing it because we're worried about what we'll find? But because people don't really associate themselves with it, they see movies like Dark Waters and they think, whoa, it must be terrible to live there. But they're not seeing it in their own backyard. And I think until we have that testing and we show it in your drinking water, and, you know, we can see that the media is interested as soon as we can say that somebody's drinking it here. That's what gets that attention on it. And it's beginning to rise. You know, people are starting to talk about it, maybe not in the community, but I would say there's been a huge change in business understanding of it. So when we started working on this we started approaching companies probably in 2019, asking for them to talk to us about this and to phase out PFAS. And the first question we always got with that when we were speaking to the food packaging people were, well, if it's dangerous, we wouldn't use it. It's definitely not in our packaging. So we actually had to go and test the packaging to say, look, it is. Now, will you speak to us? And again, the first conversations back then were always about, what is PFAS? Surely it's not a problem. Convince them of the health impacts. Now, when we go into supermarkets to talk about it, the questions are, how do we get rid of it? What are the alternatives and who's doing what? Nobody's asking me anymore, is this a problem? And that's a huge change we've seen across industry in the last couple of years. And now we're saying, you know, we go to the supermarket and they say, well, actually, we know we don't have it because our supplier got rid of it last year. So it's infiltrating across people now, but it hasn't reached the public. So to me, it's getting that personal connection with people. And I think because we're not recording it, we don't have that local community action, and it's the local community groups that have, you know, they're the ones that have gone to the paper in the States. They're the ones that have kicked up the fuss and made the media interest. So, you know, we need that human story in the UK to get media interested. But I would say that in some circumstances, there's a difficulty in telling the public, here's a problem, but there's nothing you can do about it. So what we really try to push is that if we're going to the public and we have a message, we're asking them to do something. We give them something at the end of it. So, for example, when the Dark Waters movie was coming out, we had a petition that was live that people could sign up to, and that was to ask supermarkets to get rid of it in their food packaging. But there was something people could do, so they could come in, watch that movie, you come out feeling really depressed, and what do? You just move on with your life because you can't deal with it. That's when you can get people and you can ask them, well, here's something you can do, and you feel better for it because you know you've done something. And we've also got a citizen science project running where we're asking people to do testing on their own food packaging. So if you know, anything you collect from the supermarket, any paperboard packaging you might have from a takeaway, it's a very simple test you can do at home with a bit of olive oil. You drop it on, and PFAS will give you a really nice bead of olive oil on top of it. Nothing else will give you that. You may find that the olive oil goes into the paper if there's nothing on it. It might spread out if there's like a wax coating that prevents it. But if it's PFAS, it will repel it, and the olive oil will try and get away from the surface, and it'll give you a really nice bead. It's something anybody can do really simply at home. They can then put the information into our website, and then we can use that when we're having talks with supermarkets, and we can show them the evidence behind that. So again, very small thing, but it gives somebody something that they can do. And I think it's empowering people is really important. And that's such a difficult thing to do sometimes with chemicals because they're so hard to see. Yeah.
And so do you think sort of one of the main ways that we as a collective group can make a difference would be to sort of share as much information about it as possible, and then sort of encourage people to, because I think a lot of the case, like you said, is sort of like, oh yeah, it affects them, and you know, it doesn't affect me, so I don't worry about it, and sort of like shining the light on these issues and being like, well, no, it really does affect you because you do have it in your bloodstream, and sort of getting that kind of shock factor, and then hopefully, do you think spreading the word from there would be the best way to go?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it has to be targeted to the person so that they feel engaged in the issue. So this is something that is in their life every day,
Yeah.
and I think that's really important, which is why, again, we focus quite a lot on consumer products. And again, the food packaging, that's very useful because in some sense, everything else you can choose not to buy. You don't buy a sofa very often. You don't buy carpet very often. But you buy food packaging. You get food packaging every single day. So nobody can get away from that. That's something in everybody's house all of the time. And, there's choice in that. And again, it fits in with the other messages because we're saying, stop using plastic. Let's stop using packaging wherever we don't want to. So actually the message is the same. It's like, well, let's not switch to paper, or let's not switch to compostable stuff that's full of PFAS. Let's actually say, if I don't need that piece of packaging, I'll not take it at all. So I think it's giving them something they can do every day, because if it's just when they buy a new waterproof, that's too far in the future. They're not thinking about it. And yet, you can use our bead test, things like that just gives that, so you can see the chemical. That's the real trick, is if you can get someone to visualize it. And that's a very difficult thing to do. So I'm really keen to see what you come up with.
Yes, yeah. And I think one thing that I was thinking about was in terms of, like, with other, throughout history, things that we found which have been harmful to human health, such as asbestos, for example, and BPA as well. And sort of with asbestos, that got, stopped completely. And, there's very, anywhere that there might be asbestos, it's made very clear, and that kind of, and that was very worldwide. And how come do you think that something similar hasn't happened with these chemicals? Do you think it's just because they're used in so many different products that...
I think it will. I mean, I think we're moving in that direction. And I think, we will look back. I really like to say 10 years, but at least in 20 years, my kids are going to be looking back on this and they're going to say, I can't believe you bought all that stuff. I can't believe you put that in your house. And it will get to that level. We look at, but I think that's a good point, is drawing the analogies to other things. And we quite often talk about PCBs because, it depends who you're speaking to. But if you're in an environmental if you're speaking to engaged environmentalists, they all know about PCBs. They know what a disaster that was. They know that they're still impacting orcas off the coast of Scotland today. And that's what PFAS are. They're the next PCBs, except we use them much wider because it's that persistence. And I think that example gives you the whole, look, we dealt with that 30 years ago. And yet here we have right now an orca population of Scotland dying because of PCBs.
Yeah.
So, we thought we dealt with it, and that's what PFAS is. So I think you're right, drawing the analogy to something like asbestos. People lived with it. They thought it was totally fine. Now we know the dangers of it. And it's trying to get people in the mindset that, yes, it might seem normal now, but it shouldn't be.
Yeah, exactly. I actually saw, so there's a 1999 document from 3M. It's one of the internal documents that's posted on the internet. And one of the 3M scientists describes PFAS as, quote, the most insidious pollutant since PCB. And that was back before 2000 that their own scientists were saying that. And I think it's just absolutely ridiculous that these chemicals are still widely in circulation today.
It's absolutely insane when you get into it.
It really is.
Which is actually another problem that, I quite often face this, not so much in a professional sense. I think people will listen, but if I'm talking to friends or family, one of the things I often get is like, oh, goodness sake, Kerry, it's like, you're scaremongering. It's like, surely not. And it's almost like it's too big. Yes. And I think climate change was in this problem, 20 years ago, 10 years ago. It was too big. They can't deal with it. Surely that can't happen. Yes. No government will let that happen. And that's a really difficult thing. It's to get the balance, because you've got to scare people enough, but you've got to sound legitimate. And actually, this is so bad. Yes. It's very hard to not say that.
Exactly. I think that was one of the things for our campaign in particular, is because when sort of this term, when we sort of got the brief from our module convener, and I was like, and I knew about the story behind Dark Waters and stuff, and I was like, oh, that might be something quite good to focus on. And And I told my group about it, and they were in complete disbelief. And even our lecturer was like, no, surely not. And I think one of the reasons that he really pushed for us to interview a professional like you is because you would be able to fully legitimately back up what the points that we're trying to make, because it could be seen from an outsider's perspective that it's just a bunch of university students trying to make something out of nothing, but it is actually a real tangible issue that's going on at the moment.
And you know, one of the really good, I mean, it's always worth a punt, but you can try and get in touch with Rob Bellot. I mean, what really helped the US stories is that he is such a legitimate person. So he's the lawyer behind it. And he is a very, very, you know, I got to spend quite a lot of time with him whenever they were doing the Dark Waters work in London. And he is so calm, and I mean this in a really nice way, but normal. You know, he's a middle-aged white man that looks like a lawyer, speaks like a very quiet lawyer, is not in any sense the person you would ever put in the middle of this. And yet he's really, really passionate about it. But that really sensible voice, I think, his personality, I think has actually really, really helped the campaign in the US, because there's so many big voices, and yet you have this very quiet, calm man in the middle of it who you can't help but trust. And it, you know, it's always worth reaching out to him. I think he still works at the Taft law firm, and you know, it's worth saying it to him, because he will respond to a lot of our stuff on Twitter and things like that. And you know, if you just tag him and stuff, he probably will you know, help to get that moving.
Great. And so just as a final point, is there anything else that you would like the listeners of this podcast to know, or any other points that you would like to make, or any questions that you might have to ask at all?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think in terms of, you know, things people can do, we have our bead test on our website. You know, that is really useful information for us that we can genuinely take to supermarkets.
And that's
the other thing,
free.org.uk.
Yeah, that's right. /bead test. And you'll get all the information. And, you know, I think a lot of people do this and not everybody uploads it. I know my friends keep telling me this, but if you upload the data, that's really, really useful for us. And the other thing that's worth noting is that we have a group of NGOs. There's currently 17 signatures. So we've made a PFAS statement that we have sent as part of the ongoing policy work that's happening at the minute, and we intend to send the letter to ministers in the next couple of months. We have 17 different NGOs currently signed on to it, including people like ourselves, but we've also got like whale and dolphin conservation, we've got angling groups, we've got lots of different Marine Conservation Society, Breast Cancer UK, lots of different NGOs. So I think another thing that would be really useful is if there's other NGOs that people work with, I think it's reaching out to people that have other connections, that the more signatures we can get on that. So, you know, people that work with Greenpeace, if you think Greenpeace should sign this, then tag them in some of the Twitter stuff and, you know, make them know that this is something that's happening. Anyone that we can sort of reach out to, that would be really useful. I can send you that statement. And we actually have developed a social media pack that we're just going to be launching over the next couple of weeks. So you'll start to see stuff, but I can send you that social media pack so you've got it and you can see what we did with the graphics.
Useful. That'd be really useful. Thank you very much. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's everything. I think, we covered basically much more than I was expecting to. It's brilliant. Thank you very much for taking the time to speak to me. This is going to be, really, really useful, and I really, really appreciate it. And yeah, hopefully, with enough support, we'll actually be able to get this going and build up a bit of a following. I think in particular, doing it within a university community as well would probably help quite a lot, because it's quite a liberal space, and so they always encourage that kind of stuff. So
I talked to one of the, I can't remember what it's called, what the National Union, they changed their name recently, but Students' Union body, and we did speak to them about trying to get a movement through the catering, something like that, where you're using PFAS-free packaging across university catering. So I think there's things, and I think that's quite important if you can think of a real genuine ask, especially amongst the student community. But yeah, something like PFAS-free food catering, you know, there's a start, and everybody becomes aware of it.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Dinsmore. Thank you.
No problem. You can call
Have
me
a nice
Kerry.
rest of your day.
Yeah. All right, great. See you later.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.